Daniel didn't talk much anymore, not because he was bitter or angry, but because somewhere along the way, words had stopped meaning anything. They felt hollow, like trying to explain pain to someone who'd never been burned. These days, his life moved in quiet loops. He woke, drove his second-hand delivery van from town to town, dropped off parts at people who barely remembered that he once owned the best mechanic shop in the area. He didn't try to reconnect, didn't stay long enough to be asked how he was. He preferred it that way. There was safety in detachment. 14 months had passed since the accident, 14 months since the truck ran that stop sign on County Road 9. Since the sound of twisting metal ended the only part of Daniel that still felt alive, the part that kissed scraped knees, taught how to ride a bike, and tucked in dreams at night. Everyone said it wasn't his fault, but they didn't see the car seat in the rearview mirror. They didn't hear the silence that followed. Grief had carved something out of him that wouldn't grow back. He kept moving, not because he was okay, but because he didn't know how to stop. That Thursday afternoon, he was driving along a back road he hadn't planned to take. Fog hung low, the kind that blurred everything except what was right in front of you. He had just finished a drop-off, missed the turn back to the main road, and rolled down a gravel path to circle around. That's when he heard it. A sound, faint at first. Not wind, not a branch. A whimper, high-pitched, desperate, barely there. The kind of sound you don't just hear, you feel. He stopped the van. It came again. Following instinct more than reason, he got out and walked past rusted fencing and overgrown weeds until he saw the shape slumped in the ditch. Mud-caked fur. A rope twisted around one back leg, anchored to a broken section of fence. A golden retriever, ribs visible through wet fur, barely lifting his head. He didn't bark, didn't growl. His eyes didn't flash. They begged. Daniel stood frozen for a second, the rain soft against his shoulders, the world too quiet. Then he crouched slowly, pulled a box cutter from his jacket, and sliced through the rope. The dog collapsed forward without resistance, his body folding into Daniel's arms like he'd been holding himself up for far too long. Daniel didn't remember the drive to the vet, just that he kept one hand on the dog's side the whole way, afraid the silence might return. The vet didn't ask many questions. She didn't need to. No chip, no collar, just burns from the rope, early signs of infection, and a heartbeat still holding on. "He yours?" she asked softly. "I guess," he said. He hadn't planned to say that, but saying no felt worse. He took the dog home, gave him a towel to sleep on and a bowl of water he barely touched. The dog never whimpered, never barked. He just followed Daniel from room to room, always 3 steps behind, like he didn't want to be in the way. Just nearby. He slept curled up by the door that night, as if guarding it from something neither of them could name. Daniel didn't name him, not right away. Names meant something. They implied you planned to keep things alive. But by the 3rd day, when the dog finally ate his first full meal and nudged Daniel's elbow like he'd always belonged there, the name came out without warning. Boone. The dog looked up at him, tail barely tapping against the floor, and Daniel felt something he hadn't in over a year, the smallest ache of something returning. Not joy, not yet, but presence. Boone didn't demand affection. He didn't bring toys or bark at the window. He just stayed close, not touching, but close, like he understood space, like he knew what grief smelled like and respected the weight of it. One night, Daniel woke up sweating, breath sharp from a dream he couldn't hold on to. Boone was already there, sitting upright by the bed, his eyes not on Daniel, but near him. Just watching, just staying. The next morning, Daniel opened the tool shed behind his house for the first time in a year. The air inside was thick with rust and old memories. A child's helmet still hung on the hook. A tiny wrench sat on the workbench untouched. Boone didn't follow him in. He sat at the door and waited. Daniel picked up the wrench, held it, let its weight settle into his hand like it had never left. That night, he sat on the floor beside Boone and ate a sandwich in silence. Boone didn't beg for food, he just leaned into his shoulder, gentle and warm. And for the first time since the world shattered, Daniel whispered aloud, "I'm still here." It didn't happen all at once. Healing never does. But little things began to shift, quietly, like sunlight slowly crawling across a wall. You don't see it move, but then the room is warmer. Boone started following Daniel more confidently, not like a shadow anymore, but like a companion. He waited by the bathroom door in the morning, tail thumping once when it opened. He sat just outside the garage while Daniel tinkered with old tools, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of metal against metal. The silence between them was never awkward. It was steady. Daniel didn't realize how much of himself he was rebuilding until the day he caught himself humming, just low, under his breath, while changing the oil on his own truck, something he hadn't touched in months. Boone was stretched out nearby, belly up to the sky, eyes half closed. It felt like a memory that hadn't died. Every evening, Boone would wait by the front window as the sun set, ears twitching at distant sounds. Daniel noticed how he sometimes tensed at loud engines, especially motorcycles. He'd sit perfectly still, breathing fast, until the sound passed. One afternoon, a neighbor's car backfired. Boone bolted, not out of the yard, back inside the house, under the kitchen table, shaking. Daniel didn't call him out, didn't coax or force. He just sat down beside him, legs folded awkwardly under the table, and stayed there. Boone's breathing slowed eventually. One paw reached out, resting on Daniel's boot. That night, Daniel searched for information on canine PTSD. It wasn't something he'd ever thought about, but now it made sense. The flinches, the startle reflexes, the freezing instead of barking. Boone wasn't just a rescue, he was surviving something too. The next day, Daniel took him to a new park. Not crowded, quiet. A wide open field backed by trees and an old bench no one seemed to use. Boone hesitated at first, sniffing the air, body low. But after a few minutes he started walking with more ease. His tail wagged, his steps grew lighter. Daniel threw a tennis ball once, not expecting much. Boone blinked, then ran. He didn't bring it back, just ran with it halfway across the field, flopped into the grass, and chewed it like a king guarding treasure. Daniel laughed. The sound came out strange, rusty. It surprised them both. Boone looked up, ears perked, then trotted back and dropped the ball at Daniel's feet. That night, Daniel found an old collar in the bottom drawer of his nightstand. It had belonged to the dog his son used to play with. A mutt they'd fostered once for a summer. The nameplate was gone, the fabric worn, but something about it felt right. He held it out. "Boone," he said gently, "what do you think?" Boone stepped forward, touched it with his nose. Daniel fastened it slowly, careful not to make a sudden move. Boone didn't flinch. He stood there, solid, wearing something that said, "I belong here." Later that week, while organizing boxes in the shed, Daniel found a framed picture tucked in with old tools. It was one he hadn't seen in a long time, his son, barefoot in the backyard, hugging a golden retriever that looked eerily like Boone. Only it wasn't him. Different face, different time. But the feeling was the same. Joy. Undeniable, uncomplicated joy. Daniel placed the photo on the windowsill inside the shed, beside the wrench and the oil-stained rag he still couldn't bring himself to throw out. Boone sniffed the frame once, then lay down by the door and slept like he hadn't in weeks. That weekend, Daniel took Boone for a drive with no destination, just a road and the kind of silence that no longer felt heavy. Boone had his head out the window, fur blowing, eyes closed as the breeze carried something away. Maybe fear, maybe memory. Daniel didn't ask, he just drove. And in a moment that felt as small as breath and as big as grief, he whispered, "I'm glad you found me." Boone turned and looked at him, not wagging, not panting, just looking. And Daniel didn't feel alone in that van anymore. When they got home, Boone waited by the door like always, But this time, he didn't go in first. He looked up at Daniel, waited, and when Daniel opened the door, Boone brushed against his leg before walking in. Not like a visitor, like he lived there now. The storm hit without warning. The forecast had said light rain, maybe drizzle, but by late afternoon, thunder cracked across the sky like a wound tearing open. Daniel was in the shed, sorting through old sockets and extension cords, when the first gust slammed the back door against the frame. He looked up. The sky had turned greenish-gray, dense like smoke. He moved quickly to call Boone back inside, but the dog wasn't in the yard, not in the shed, not in the house. "Boone?" His voice was louder than it had been in months, more urgent. He checked every room twice, his boots wet from tracking and rain, heart thudding against his ribs. Boone wasn't there. He grabbed his jacket, keys, and flashlight and stepped into the street. The wind tugged at his sleeves like something trying to pull him back. It was already pouring by the time he reached the park. The first few minutes were denial. Boone never ran, never left the yard without Daniel. He always waited, always stayed, but the fence had been cracked near the back corner. Daniel had noticed it earlier in the week and hadn't fixed it. That guilt hit hard now, sharp as the wind slicing across his face. He drove with the windows down despite the rain, calling Boone's name through the storm. The streets were empty. Flashlights glared off puddles and the sides of parked cars. Every alley looked the same. Every yard felt unfamiliar. And the longer he searched, the more the fear started curling in his stomach. Not fear of Boone getting hurt, but something deeper. He wasn't just afraid of losing the dog. He was afraid of losing someone again. Daniel stopped the car near the gas station on Main and stepped out, soaking wet. He checked behind the dumpsters, under the overhang, around the lot where Boone liked to sit when they passed by. Nothing. Then, just as he was turning back, he caught a movement near the old phone booth, barely visible through the sheets of rain. A golden shape, low to the ground, shaking, soaked to the bone. Boone. Daniel called his name, softly now, unsure if the sound would carry through the wind. Boone didn't move. He stayed curled, eyes open, as if frozen in a memory Daniel couldn't reach. It took everything in him to stay calm. He knelt slowly, palms open. "Boone, it's me." Boone lifted his head, ears flat, body trembling. His eyes didn't show fear. They showed something worse, the look of someone bracing to be left behind again. And in that moment, Daniel understood. Boone hadn't run away. He'd gone back to the only kind of moment his body remembered: rain, loneliness, waiting. Daniel stepped closer, still kneeling. Let the rain pour down his back as he whispered again, "You came back. You came back to me." Boone moved then, crawled forward until his head rested against Daniel's chest. Daniel wrapped both arms around him, pressed his face into the soaked fur, and felt something break open inside of him, not like a wound, but like a door. They stayed like that for a long time. Eventually the storm began to pass. Back home, Boone curled up by the bed, this time with one paw resting over Daniel's boot. Daniel didn't sleep. He sat there on the floor beside him, hand gently on Boone's ribs, counting the breaths. He thought about the sound of his son's laugh, about the wrench on the bench, about how healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering without breaking every time. He looked at Boone. "You stayed," he whispered. Boone didn't move, didn't need to. Daniel knew now. The next morning he fixed the fence first thing, reinforced every slat. Not because he thought Boone would run again, but because some things deserve to be protected right. Then he found an old spiral notebook in a kitchen drawer and started writing. Not a journal, not stories, just thoughts, bits of memory, moments that used to hurt and now didn't as much. On the first page he wrote, "The dog I saved reminded me how to breathe." Then he placed the notebook on the counter, poured 2 bowls of food, and called Boone to his side. They ate together, not because they needed to, because they could. Daniel started waking up before the alarm, Not out of anxiety, but because Boone had created a rhythm, a life that moved. They had morning rituals now. Boone would nudge Daniel's elbow softly at 6:30, and they'd walk the perimeter of the yard together while the world was still wrapped in gray. It was the first time Daniel had ever looked forward to anything since the accident. He fixed the fence, then the back gate, then the porch step. He bought lumber, nails, spent an entire weekend building Boone a raised wooden bed beneath the covered deck, painting the edges bright blue, the color his son used to call sky on the ground. Every small task brought back a memory. At first, they hurt, but over time, they stopped being wounds and became presents, pieces of someone who wasn't gone, just quietly part of everything that still mattered. The photo on the shed windowsill stayed where it was. Boone liked to sit near it, facing the trees. Daniel never moved it, never dusted the frame. He let it exist there, a silent guardian of a chapter that no longer ended in tragedy. One afternoon, while checking mail at the local shelter's bulletin board, Daniel noticed a flyer about therapy animal visits to children's hospitals. He read it twice, hand resting on Boone's leash. He didn't decide right away, but he took the paper home. 2 days later, he called. The volunteer coordinator's voice was warm, curious. She asked gentle questions about Boone, his temperament, training, health. When Daniel said Boone had never been formally trained but had the soul of a saint, she laughed. "You'd be surprised," she said. "Sometimes the best ones are the ones who already did the work. They just needed someone to notice." Boone passed the temperament test like it was instinct. He didn't bark, didn't jump. He walked beside children like he understood how small their bodies were. One boy clung to Boone's ear and whispered secrets. Another just sat and cried, forehead pressed to Boone's shoulder. Daniel stood back, watching it all unfold. Something inside him, a space he didn't know was still hollow, began to fill. He signed them up for weekly visits. At home, Boone began sleeping beside Daniel's bed instead of across the room. Wren, the neighbor's stray cat who started coming around after Boone shared his food bowl one afternoon, claimed the armrest of the living room couch like she'd always lived there. Daniel didn't chase her away. He started cooking again, buying real groceries, cleaning the windows, fixing the paint in the hallway his son once scribbled on with markers. He didn't erase the marks, he framed them. He started talking again. Not long conversations, but soft phrases throughout the day. "Let's go." "You ready?" Or "Good job, buddy." Words that had once been buried beneath silence now returned like old friends, not loud, but steady. One Sunday morning, Daniel brought Boone to the same hospital wing where his son had once stayed overnight for a mild concussion. He hadn't been back since. The walls were brighter now, murals of clouds and cartoon bears. Boone walked slowly, head level, letting small hands reach and tug and giggle. A nurse tapped Daniel's arm. "There's a girl in room 4. She hasn't spoken in days. Maybe—" She trailed off. Daniel didn't ask questions. He just nodded. Boone stepped inside first. The girl sat cross-legged on the bed, arms wrapped around her knees. Her IV cord drooped beside her like a forgotten vine. Boone walked to the center of the room and sat. He didn't move forward. He didn't wait for a cue. He just looked at her. And waited. After a long minute, she slid her legs off the bed and lowered herself onto the floor. She didn't speak, just reached out. Boone leaned in gently, head against her chest. She smiled. Only a little. But it was enough. Later that day, a nurse handed Daniel a drawing the girl had made. Crayon lines. A golden dog, a girl with pigtails, a blue sky. The words, "Thank you," scrawled in the corner. Daniel folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside his notebook. That night, he wrote again. "I used to think I lost my son forever, but every time Boone brings light into another kid's eyes, I see him. Not as a ghost, as a guide." He closed the notebook and set it beside Boone's bed. Boone was already asleep, dreaming. Spring came late that year. The wind was soft, but the trees took their time. Tiny buds clung to the ends of the branches like they weren't quite sure it was safe to grow yet. Daniel understood that feeling. He was different now, not healed, not better, but returned, to movement, to days that felt like they meant something. His mornings began with Boone's nudge and a slow walk beneath the trees. His nights ended with the weight of Boone's body curled against his bed, solid and warm. And between those hours, there was enough space for things like breath, laughter, silence, and something resembling peace. Boone had become more than a dog. He was a ritual, a witness, a reminder that even broken things can become sacred. The hospital visits had become the highlight of Daniel's week. Boone knew which children needed space, which needed contact, and which just needed to look at something kind for a while. Wren, the cat who once wouldn't let anyone near her, now occasionally joined the visits in her own way, curling up in Daniel's duffel bag until she chose to emerge, graceful and unbothered, as if she'd been invited. At home, the backyard bloomed again. Daniel planted new grass, painted the fence, and built a wooden ramp so Boone wouldn't strain his hips. He added a second bed to the porch for Wren, though she rarely used it. She preferred the arm of the couch, or Boone's side. One day, while cleaning out a corner of the garage, Daniel found an old shoebox filled with drawings, stick figures, crooked hearts, and short messages in crayon. His son had made them for birthdays, for rainy days, for no reason at all. At the bottom of the stack was a folded piece of lined paper with a sentence that made Daniel sit down right where he stood. "When I grow up, I want to help people feel safe." He held the paper for a long time. Then he looked at Boone, who was lying just outside the garage, watching with quiet eyes. And Daniel smiled. A few weeks later, Daniel was invited to speak at a community event about therapy animals and recovery. He almost said no, but Boone walked to the front door as if he'd already decided for them. So they went. Daniel stood on stage with Boone at his side. He wasn't eloquent, he wasn't rehearsed, but his voice was steady. "I rescued Boone in a rainstorm. He was shaking, filthy, and tied to a fence, but I think somehow I was the one he came for, because I wasn't living. I was existing." He looked down at Boone, who looked back without blinking. "This dog didn't just save my life. He gave it back to me." When the event ended, a woman approached him in tears. Her teenage son had stopped speaking after a traumatic loss. She asked if they could meet Boone. Boone didn't hesitate, and when the boy placed his hand on Boone's back, Daniel watched the way his shoulders dropped, the way his chin lifted, like someone stepping out of water. Boone had that effect, on people, on grief, on silence. That night, Daniel sat on the porch with Boone at his feet, and Wren nestled in the blanket beside them. The wind was calm, the sky a deep navy, one star blinking stubbornly through a break in the clouds. He opened his notebook again, wrote, "Grief didn't disappear, but it stopped being the loudest thing in the room." He closed the notebook, not because the story was over, but because it no longer needed to be written every night. Boone stirred in his sleep, ears twitching. Wren stretched and rolled closer, her tiny body pressed against his ribs. Daniel leaned back in the chair, had hand resting over his heart, and let the quiet settle. He didn't need to be whole again. He just needed to believe that life could still be full. If this story reminded you of someone who stayed when you didn't know how to keep going, share it. Let them know. Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks beside you. One paw, one step, one breath at a time.